The motion before the House is, this House believes that post-colonial states should actively adopt the narrative that their independence is the result of individual agents as opposed to structural causes. The teams for the grand final are as follows. Speaking on proposition, we have Falling Up. Speaking on opposition, we have team We Sell Our Stuff to Debate Here. The grand final adjudication panel is as follows. On the chair, we have Mr. Ronny Tong, Mr. Cheng Kwok, Miss Airile Heung, Wong, Nicole Liu. And the chairperson is Thomas Yeon. Speaking first on proposition, we have on first speaker, Artie Lam. Speaking second, we have Thomas Yeon. Speaking third, we have Timothy Low. On opposition, speaking first, we have Martin Chow. Speaking second, Wong. Speaking third, Wong. The reply speech will be offered by Wong. Speeches will be 6 minutes long, with one clap between at the first and the fifth minutes to indicate the VOI time period. There will be 2 claps at 6 minutes and 3 claps at 6 minutes and 15 seconds to indicate the end of the speech. The question section will be opened after the third speaker from opposition has delivered the speech. And after the question section, they will deliver the reply speech. Without further ado, may I now please invite the first speaker from side proposition to open the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, today our side believes that in order to achieve social change and bring change to different unjust things in the society, in a post-colonialist society, we believe that it is very important to have the participation of the citizens of the nation. And we believe that only by adopting the narrative that independence is brought about by individual agents can we have this sense of identity and sense of belonging of the state. Before I move on, I would like to define some terms in our debate. We define post-colonial states as states which has previously been under colonial rule of foreign countries and has gained independent sovereignty afterwards. And now let me move on. So what do we mean today here by individual agents? We mean by that people fought for independence themselves. The citizens they fought and inherently gained independence as a result. We believe that they will be more likely to identify themselves as citizens of that state. They will have a more stronger sense of belonging to the state, as they felt that they have brought about this change. They have become the true masters of their own country, and it was them who brought about this change. We see that by adopting this narrative, it can empower citizens within the post-colonialist society, that they deserve to have a say in the society, and they deserve to move forward social change and different organic changes within the society. And thus, it will transpire these values into different communities, and they will be more willing, and they will feel like participating in different social issues and participating in social change. And that is why we see individual agents as important, as more important than structural causes. Now, what do we mean by structural causes here? We mean that structural causes were simply, they only gained independence because of power dynamics within countries. For example, different countries gained independence from the United Kingdom because they were weaker after the World Wars. We believe that by having people believe that they only gained independence because their original sovereign state was weakened, was inherently not helping with any of the identities or social changes. And we believe that that is not the most ideal thing that we want people to be thinking. Why is that? It is because even if the original sovereign state has disappeared from their country, we still believe that the mindset of colonialism, that they are subservient, is still at the roots of their minds. We still believe that people are still thinking that they are still inferior, they are still not the true masters of their country. We see subconscious colonialism after they gain independence. So why is that problematic? We see with all these, people will not establish a real sense of identity. People will not be willing to really participate in different social discourses as to bring justice to the society, making things fairer and better. We see that structural causes, why is that problematic to the people, to the society? Why is that alienating people? Why is that not making people feel that they belong to the state, they belong to the country, and that they own the country, they are the true masters of the country? It's because structural causes are inherently invisible. They cannot really see structural causes happening. They can only see, or maybe the flag was changed, or maybe the leadership was changed. They don't feel related to this change. We see that structural causes cannot really relate to the people, cannot really relate to the general population, and the general population don't really feel they belong to the nation. So we see that in order to bring fundamental change to the society, we see that it is important to have this notion implanted in people's heart. Yes.
Before these states become independent, even then, not every single member of that particular colonized state agreed with leading the empire. So wouldn't your narrative of saying, oh, this independence movement was brought about by members of this republic, wouldn't that be a little bit disingenuous in terms of historical accuracy?
Well, since these post-colonial countries are now independent, we have to focus on issues that make the place better, not dwelling with the past. We have to see that although not everyone agrees with independence, not everyone agrees with that, since they are now independent, they must be able to solve problems on their own and to bring changes on their own to the society in order to claim the true ownership to their countries. So now, in conclusion, what will our side and what have our side proved to you today? We see that individual agents are, the narrative of this is way more effective and better than the notion that independence was only brought about by structural causes, simply because people will be more willing to participate. People will have a stronger sense of belonging and identity, which we see is inherently a good thing, and it is important to have it in the post-colonial society. And therefore, our side today is proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech. May I now invite the first speaker from opposition, Martin Chow, to open the case for opposition. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, two things for my speech today. Firstly, I'll be talking about why this emphasis on individual agents will be harmful to the country and will be actually doing the opposite thing as what the proposition has claimed, because it doesn't help in uniting the people under the flag of the country. Second idea on my speech will be on the idea of how structural causes have very high utility in pushing forward the future development of a country and help to make the state into a better place. I will incorporate my rebuttals into my substantives. Let's be very clear. We recognize how the proposition wish that the people in the state stay cohesive, how they wish they stay nationalistic, they retain the sense of belonging to a country. But we as opposition, we believe that the post-colonial era is more than that. It's more than people staying together. It's actually a matter of how you make the country a better place. And we believe that ultimately this emphasis on individual agents, emphasis on your ancestors giving out your effort, emphasis on this idea of kinship and bloodline that your own very people help lead to this independence, we believe that it's not helpful. This is why it is not helpful. Because ultimately, as we have pointed out earlier, we see how basically you cannot assure that every single person in that country will agree with that particular individual agent's contribution, which means ultimately there are bound to be people who may, A, as we have said before, actually prefer the former, allow me to say, empire, or B, there may be people who do not like the former ruler but do not really agree with the contribution of the individual agent, which these two things will result in are the circumstances where people are divisive, because ultimately they believe that they should give credit to things that are quite different. They do not agree with each other in terms of what exactly is are the factors that lead to the current state of my country now. Which ultimately, you see the example of how the American history has always been emphasizing on, say, the contribution of the ancestors fighting against the British colony. How they always emphasize on founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. But the thing is, if you look at the average citizen, they simply do not care. They couldn't care less who are the people, who are his ancestors actually help fight for independence. If you ask them about Thomas Jefferson, all they know is Jefferson's Starships, the rock band in the 70s. These are things that is happening in reality. Ultimately, you see how after the years have passed, you see how this kind of tight link with the so-called ancestors have already been declined into things that are more visible, things that are more objective, things that are more easily recognized, easily connected to our daily lives, such as the structural integrity in society, such as unemployment rates, such as production, such as economic strength. These are the things that we believe ultimately today we have to pay special attention to when compared to the potential contribution from individual agents. Because ultimately, we believe that we want to look at the transition of post-colonial states into independent states in a very objective manner, in the sense that we do not want to label that the previous empire is evil. We do not want to put a false label to condemn whether the particular empire previously is always the bad party or not. What does it lead to is the things I'll be talking about later on. It's about the idea of how you have more emphasis on structural causes will give you a larger pool of information to lead to a better future development in terms of better choices and better decision making, not now. So what do I mean by future development? What do I mean by better choices? As I said before, if you allow this kind of independence to be attributed to structural causes, you are able to look at things that are objectively seen. For example, as I said, unemployment rates, for example, previous industrial policies. These are things that maybe still have some traces of goodness in the previous ruler. For example, you have the British colonizing other countries, right? But you look at the British Industrial Revolution, these are things that current states can really learn. These are things that current states can learn from the effectiveness, the efficiency and utilization of different resources and capital by the British Empire. Despite the fact that they colonized the country, these are good things that you cannot objectively dispute, don't you agree?
How does that fall in the motion, unless you're suggesting that the Industrial Revolution caused decolonization in these many countries?
No, sorry. I think you misunderstood me. Because what we actually look at as structural causes, as the proposition also agrees, is basically about the dynamics within society. It's about the things in a macro level, things that different interactions between parties, between different strata of society. And this is what we believe has, even if people may not all like the previous ruler, they may still recognize some objective goodness of it. And this is what we require in today's era. Because ultimately, as I said in the very beginning of my introduction, we are here to make the country or make the state a better place. We are not here to put the blame or to put the credit to individual agents and to evaluate whether this particular group of people do the right thing or they do the wrong thing. Because ultimately what we see is that we want visible parameters for the current administration to be able to follow. We want visible, quantifiable and quality factors that people in the office, people in government can actually look at and to make a decision on these phenomena. Look at these phenomena. These are the things that cause our independence. Are these things good in the past? Are these things still applicable? For example, industrialization, right? Use of machines. Are these things still applicable to post-colonial states that are previously colonized by Britain? These are the things that we want, because ultimately we believe that this sense of objectivity gives a larger pool of information, and we always want more information, especially for those who are now in authority to make this decision for the entire country to move forward or not. Because ultimately we believe that information is always good. The more information, the better. Therefore, for the betterment of countries, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech. May I now invite the second speaker from Proposition to continue the case. Here.
Thinks that opposition really understands what's going on in this debate, right? Because we don't believe that the Industrial Revolution is an attributable cause to these states actually becoming independent post-colonial, right? What we essentially believe this debate is about is what these states should emphasize, as Martin mentioned, during their transition from a post-colonial state to an independent state, right? And we believe that exactly in that moment, the most important thing is to get the mindset of the people in these states in the right direction, to let them understand that colonialism has passed. Let them understand that they are in control of the future of their own country now, and essentially to let these problems that colonialism imprints on these states to get away. That's exactly what I'm going to address in my speech in terms of two arguments. Number one, how essentially this helps the people to strive for change and what essentially that changes. And secondly, how this also helps reconciliation within the society. Right? But before that, let's take a look at what government gave us. Because we only got one thing, which is this very vague idea of how these structural causes actually benefit the government. Right? Number one, we don't essentially see any explanation on how adapting these structural causes, even if they fall within this motion, actually helps the government. Because what we essentially believe is that, number one, structural causes, for example, of why Britain became weaker post-World War II doesn't necessarily have much impact in the post-colonial state. We're just looking to rebrand its own identity. We're just looking to have its people embrace the fact that it's already a new state, to have these people to build that. Right? We don't essentially see the relevance between the two, given that one attributes a very strong empire crumbling down, and the other attributes a new state growing up. Right? But more importantly, what we essentially see, the biggest contention that they actually give us is that for these states, these individuals do not matter anymore. We argue that, number one, given that if we are talking about a situation where the transition of post-colonial states to independent states, where these events have just happened, where these individuals are very fresh in the people's minds, we argue that essentially they are very important in this case. We don't think America, after so many years, would be relevant in this debate, right? But more importantly, what we tell you is that these people and these individuals send a very important message that Artie emphasized on the line, that these individuals are actually responsible for these changes, right? Because what happens with structural causes is this: the role of the people in that state, the role of everyone, is essentially very passive, right? Because, for example, Britain's weakening after World War II did not have much to do with them in the first place, right? So what this essentially does is it exacerbates the post-colonial aesthetics that I'm going to talk about in my substantive right now. Artie talked about how essentially during post-colonialism, the image of colonialism does not leave these people automatically, right? Given that they were subject to so much oppression before, given that they were always seen as subservient when their state was under colonialism, given that this perpetuates into their mind, it's in their education that, for example, they do not deserve to live on the peak because they're Chinese, right? We argue that essentially, even after the flag has changed in this state, this does not essentially change overnight. What we essentially need is for these people to actually understand that now the state is different. And we argue this is especially important because there are many imprints, as I mentioned before, of colonialism on these states. We still see, even after post-colonialism, we still see discriminatory laws around the way. We still see discriminatory practices that need people to come up and abolish. Right? We need people to fight for these causes, and we argue that if we attribute colonialism to something that is a cause that has nothing to do with the people, this mindset that people are still subservient, this mindset that people are still inferior, still exacerbated, right? These people will not see these, for example, discriminatory laws, will not see these things as a problem, right? So what essentially happens is that these post-colonial states actually will not fight for what these people truly deserve, right? We argue that this is not only problematic on the first level, but more importantly, also restricts how these people view themselves. Right? So, because especially given that this message that they get that they're inferior appeals to their subconsciousness, right? Appeals to the fact that it is something that they've been faced with so long over the years. We argue that if we do not attribute the fact that each and every person is responsible for this new state, each and every person actually has a rallying banner around to turn the state around, we essentially believe that this will continue to exacerbate, and it will be much easier for them to accept this message, just so embedded into subconsciousness. If we compare to new message that, hey, you guys are not actually inferior anymore. You guys actually deserve to continue on and to build this state up. We don't essentially believe that people who make this choice, we argue that these post-colonial states will be where they are, right? But more importantly, why would passing this motion essentially help reconciliation, even if we take their point that, hey, some people don't agree with leaving the colony, right? To begin with, we argue that that problem exists on both paradigms, given that even if we take their case, there are still people who are not going to agree with leaving independence, right? The more important part is this, where we mobilize people to understand that they actually have caused independence now, and they're capable of pushing for more social change. And it actually creates an incentive for them to stop all these social problems, right? It creates an incentive for them to actually reconcile with these people and say, hey, what's in the past is in the past, but now what we need to do and what we need to push forward is essentially to help this state get on its footing and move forward, right? They need to educate these people and tell them, hey, you guys are actually not inferior, you guys actually deserve more than this, we actually deserve this, and we actually need to push for it in these states. What we essentially see is lacking is that people are still drunk on the mindset that they do not deserve these things, and this is essentially very problematic given that there's no motivation for anyone with social change, and more importantly, without this motion passing, all voices which ask for social change would be drowned, given that people can simply point to this structural cause and say, hey, that's the exact reason why this happened, right? We don't essentially see why you guys are fighting for this. We don't essentially see why we deserve this. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we essentially believe that in terms of the people in these post-colonial states, in terms of what they deserve, and more importantly, to actually allow these people to actively take a role in society, to fight for what they need, to actively, as Artie mentioned, construct their identity as part of something new, instead of stagnating within the colonial aesthetics, to actually fight for things, abolish laws that are actually discriminatory to them, to actually fight for equality in these places. We are very, very proud to propose this motion.
I thank you, the speaker, for his foreign speech. May I now invite the second speaker from opposition to continue the debate. Here, here.
The 19th and 20th centuries are a very interesting period in human history. It is very interesting because it was an era of great progress and great horror. We think it is better for post-colonial states to recognize the horror as well as the progress. A proposition's narrative is by definition, by default, inclined to say that the imperial history was by default bad. It provides a foundation for people on the ground to build up a narrative that the imperialist era has nothing good in it. We think this is not necessarily good for post-colonial states. We don't think it is good for the development of these post-colonial states. We do not think it is conducive to recognizing the harms, the horrors, and what is left of whichever empire that ruled them. And that is why we think proposition does not win. Let's take a look at the two ideas, right? Essentially, Joshua came out and told us that empires are bad. Empires are based on discrimination, and people need to know it, right? That is the emphasis. And they believe that the narrative, people can only know it best if this narrative is upheld, right? We felt, no. We think that the people of India are pretty educated about the horrors of the British Empire. We feel the people of Vietnam are pretty educated about the horrors of the French Empire. But they also know that the reason why they got independence is partially because of the fact that, first, I'm not going to give you an education as a history lecture, but the thing is that structural dynamics, international structural dynamics did play a role in the independence movement of India and in Vietnam, right? People know that these are the reasons, and they use that knowledge to propel their nation into the future because they would avoid the same mistakes again, right, ladies and gentlemen? If you subscribe to the kind of narrative construction of the proposition, we believe that the people on the ground will be deprived to a certain extent of this knowledge. We think the narrative in general would ignore and overlook these particular factors which would be detrimental to the construction of the state, right? But secondly, let's take a look at this, right? Joshua said that, okay, people can't, not all people will agree that imperialism was bad on both sides of the paradigm. We say, yeah, but you won't anger them by saying that their opinions don't matter if you subscribe to our side of the debate, right? When you subscribe to their side of the debate, you're essentially saying that independence was good and your opinions don't really matter, and this is the national narrative that you must subscribe to. I will do a little bit of analysis now. Let's take a look at individual ages and the narrative built on it. The first impression we get is that it's very empty, right? Of course, independence movements are a result. Of course, individual ages played a role in the independence movement of many countries because wars are fought by people. But secondly, we feel that by definition, it is impossible to construct a social narrative that says, okay, that places the role of individual ages on a pedestal, right? Because it's stupid to say, okay, the people of Vietnam fought against the French Empire and independence was bad. You can't say that. It's stupid, right? The only consistent narrative that you can construct is say the Vietnamese people fought against the French Empire and it was a good way forward. The Vietnamese people are heroes and the French Empire was the evil that we fought, right? That is the kind of simplistic narrative that will take place if the proposition wins. We feel that is not necessarily conducive to these societies. We don't feel it's good, partly because these empires left something behind which might be useful or good for these post-colonial states, but also because there are people who benefited from the empire. We feel on these two grounds, this kind of narrative is not necessarily conducive. I'm going to talk about it later. But secondly, we think that this kind of narrative overemphasizes the importance of individual agents, and this is historically disingenuous and might be even inaccurate a narrative. We do not think it helps these nations to prepare themselves for the future. What do we mean by that? And we also think that structural causes are also very important to understanding why certain nations got independent. Let's take a look at this example, my favorite example, China. During the Taiping Rebellion, right? The reason why China was so screwed back then is because of very visible structural causes, right? Essentially Western powers are fighting for land and whatever in China, right? These are very real reasons why China was so screwed back then. We take a look at another reason. Why did the communists manage to take power inside China and expel whoever, the rest of the Western imperialists? It's partially because the Japanese Empire was invading in China, and there's a war in Europe and so on. There's the United States, right? All of these are structural dynamics. All of these are reasons that are very real and cannot be omitted in your narrative, right? We even look at other examples. Let's take, for example, Taiwan, in which we believe that constructing a social narrative based on that, there were individual agents involved, it would be historically disingenuous because the Taiwanese got independence from the Japanese Empire, not necessarily because the Taiwanese were fighting against the Japanese Empire, but more because the Japanese Empire suddenly collapsed, right? We think that to construct a social narrative based solely on individual agents and ignore structural causes is not genuine. Why do we think that is bad? We think ultimately because if we take an example of China, China took great lesson from the fact that its weakness and the fact it was being bullied was because of structural causes, which is why it's now building its military so big, right? So quickly, right? We think that if you ignore those factors and if you do not subscribe to those narratives, what you're doing is that it will translate into bad societal and military and government decisions, right? It will secondly, it will create people who do not necessarily agree with that narrative. It causes social division, which is not good in these societies that are highly divisive. And because of all these reasons, we beg to oppose. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech. May I now invite the third speaker from Proposition to continue the debate. Here.
Let's take a step back from this entire debate, right? So, how does independent movement actually occur? I will tell you independent movement occurs with efforts from individual agents as well as structural causes, right? I believe both sides recognizes that. But this debate is more about which sides actually, within a post-colonial era, that tells the people that you're actually part of reforms, you're actually part of social changes that we don't see, however necessarily is brought up by this side, right? So before I begin on the three caches I have today, which is like firstly on education and social changes, and then second on what brings these sort of changes, and secondly on how we prolong the peaceful period of identity construction as to affect the country's position in the future. I'm going to deliver a few rebuttals, right? So firstly, let's dissect about what's the dynamics within the domestically within these countries itself, right? So we see that the upper class has dominated a lot of like social and economic capital within these sort of countries. Right? We see the middle lower class have long been disinterested with the politics as well as the social developments within the country. Why? Because of all sorts of structural reasons they've talked about, right? Because they feel, oh, China is inherently weak within the world dynamics. Therefore, they don't think they are part of they can have an active contribution towards the changes, towards reforms in that era. And we think that essentially affects the era afterwards, right? Really people don't feel empowered to drive the changes, right? And secondly, right, onto why we think it's time, right, we think it's not only the government dominating these. We tell you that government officials and in these upper class already recognize all sorts of structural reasons that propels the country to be lag behind. Right? We think all sorts of people actually recognize that. Right? But the point today is whether you enlarge the inclusiveness of like participation of your country with these citizens, right? We think essentially it matters because essentially it matters to bring these people to actually not reinforce the notion that you're subservient, rather you take an active role. So we'll try to I'll elaborate more on my first passions on what drives better education and social changes. Right? We think. We're not advocating for the notion that imperialistic era is absolutely bad and horrific, right? But the point today here is people's personal experiences already recognizes they are being oppressed, right? For instance, right, why can't I live on the peak when Hong Kong was like dominated, when occupied by Britain, right? Why do I have to work with white people? Why am I obliged to work with white people, right? The point today here, we tell you, the fundamental point we tell you here today is people's personal experience already recognizes how bad the country are, right? The upper class already recognizes that the weaknesses and the power dynamics with the world that coerce them into a position that does not allow them to thrive globally, right? right? We think that sort of dynamics has already changed, right? We think both sides contend the fact that these sort of dynamics have changed ever since, right? The crucial crux that lies within today here is how how for these people to adapt these sort of dynamic change within the world. And we think our side better does that, right? I'll explain in my second clash here today, right? But further, to rebut the case here today, they also told you why this will affect people who actually like colonialism, right? We tell you these drove attention, and we believe these people already will be propelled to drive their greater attention toward larger communities who dislike colonialism, right? We believe they are also obliged to take part of these communities and these movements in order to empower their own countries and citizens. And more important. And the second most important clash within this debate is identity construction. I will tell you. We tell you when people experience years of misery of realizing who they actually are, what culture do they actually belong to. We believe it is time to give them the sort of the power and the perception that they are able to construct their own sort of culture. Why do we think that is a good thing, right? Because that empowers them to prepare for the future on matters of structural changes, right? Because they think, oh, I can have a say on how my government formulate the policies, right? I can have a say on why the government should not establish discriminatory laws against me. In comparison, right, we think their side didn't mention that at all, right? Because what they're simply doing is, okay, structural causes. Really, the very connotations of structural causes relates with all the upper elites and the governments that drive these changes, right? We don't think that happens under our world here today. But more importantly, we think a country as a whole can more confidently assert their own position on the international stage. Why? Because people have better faith and a better engagement with the government and the society and the civil society. Right? We believe people are more active in taking part of movements that drive social and economic changes. Right? Whereas we don't think we can achieve that on this side because people so blindly believe that it's only structural changes, it's only Marxism, capitalism, such large social vehicles that runs the society. Whereas now we actually enlarge the scope and inclusiveness of bringing these group of people more into social changes, and from that moment they distance their history, or the distance with their history, and recognize it's time for redevelopment and the establishing of their own culture from that very point. Right? We don't think that by simply we're not today we're not the side that stands for the negligence and simply neglecting the part of history. But we think it's far more important for these people and prioritize these people to give these people the right and the conception that they are once again in charge of the country, that they should be the ones to decide the fate. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech. May I now invite the third speaker from our position to continue the debate. Here.
The other side basically has committed a lot of logical flaws to start with. We think that first of all, Mr. Speaker, if they are actually wanting to promote social change, bring up social change in the post-colonial states, then why shouldn't they care more about the social or structural changes to start with, right? I think it is extremely peculiar for them to actually focusing on those individual agents instead of the social changes that causes, for example, the potential fall down of a particular empire, and instead, and because at the end of the day, this is the burden that they have identified, right? At the end of the day, it is these guys that they say that they want to bring up social changes, but instead of focusing on the social reasons that causes the downfall of a particular empire, instead of learning from those mistakes, they identify them mistakenly from those individual agents. I think it is extremely peculiar in terms of therefore having a logical flaws to start with. And secondly, we think that the other thing that these guys want to talk about is basically helping people to move on, right? But we think that by always having this actively narrative that you need to remember you as a person down the ground is you who fight for the state's independence, it will only prevent people from arriving closer to start with, right? Because you're constantly reminding people that these countries are screwing us up, and therefore we need to build this identity back. So we think that at the end of the day, what people will have at the back of their mind is a constant atrocity that has been done to them by other countries, and therefore it is counterintuitive if they actually want to arrive at closure, something that these guys have taken up their burden actively. And thirdly, about the idea of mechanism of social change, you think that basically there's a vacuum of characterization in terms of how social change they want to bring about, because these guys are like, oh, as long as you make people feel better about their self-esteem, right, then for some reason there will be like organic social change, right? You think that there's this like huge logical jump in terms of how this is happening, or why suddenly you make people feel better about their self-esteem, that suddenly organic social change will happen. And the last speaker basically just told us that for some arbitrary reason that people down the ground will suddenly have their say because of their policy, and we don't think that's suddenly why. For example, the reason why we think about identity has anything to do with people having a say in terms of in the parliament actually. So we think that this is extremely peculiar about their stance and also about their idea. But then that's one of the questions of today's debate, right? So we think that first of all, I'll talk about this in terms of two things. First of all, in terms of public perception, and also about the nature of individual agency. But first of all, let's talk about public perception. Because we think that they have completely put this idea into a vacuum, right? They never care about, as long as this idea is being actively adopted by the state, how will people actually perceive it, right? Because we think that ultimately what happens, the thing that affects the people's responses down the ground. And we think that what happens is that because these guys want to set this debate into a transition period, right? We think that sure. So we think that especially in this transitional period, we think it is very easy for this anti-colonial narrative to still linger in the society, right? We think that people, for example, they will still remember the bad things that have been doing to them. So there are bad things doing to them in the previous period. So we think that what happens is that they will easily take it to the extreme, right? The people that are down the ground, because these guys are they will basically assume the people will all take it easily or peaceful manner. But what happens? They ignore the very fact that it is very easy for people to take it to the extreme and say that this is actually the country has been screwing us up, and therefore I will develop the us versus other mentality against this country. You think that it is extremely bad for both sides, and it is something that they have completely ignored throughout down the batch, which is about the public perception. So because people always remember, oh, it is too aggressive that the country is fought back. So therefore, we think that this is extremely bad to the idea. But moreover, we also told you, Wong exclusively told you how this potentially, this idea of this idea easily will translate into some of the improper national policy to start with, right? We have already given you a concrete example of China, which they basically taken this mentality into the extreme and therefore implement some policies that are actually improper and bad. So thank you. And then moving on to the next course of the debate, which is about the nature of individual agency. So basically, we've already told you that they have basically put this debate in a vacuum, because basically, of course, the people in a way down the ground, to a certain extent, they will be agreeing with the fact that they're actually fighting this country back. We think that we take it for granted that this is true, right? But we think that what happens, and they completely ignore, is that the population at times is actually divided, right? This is something that what Martin has exclusively told you. It talks about how basically also people don't personally agree with the identity these guys are trying to be, right? So also times, for example, we hear the term Anglophiles because sometimes the people actually think that the colonist administration in the country is actually better, right? So what happens is that these guys, they are further dividing the nation, right, against the people's view per se, because they're having a particular narrative selling to these type of people. But then more importantly, yeah, so we think they're completely ignoring the view of the people. No, sure.
Why would individuals who are previously not inspired, not empowered to make changes, now not be able to translate their wish into real political capital?
Because you assume all the populations are homogeneous instead of viewing people down the ground as individualistic beings. You assume that all people down the ground have the same view about the same thing. And we think this is particularly harmful per se, especially if you want to construct a national identity. We think what you are doing is exactly opposite. So you think that at the end of the day, what they are doing is that they basically identify an extremely huge burden about social change with a vacuum mechanization in terms of how this will happen. But more importantly, instead of caring about the social change, which should be something that they should be caring, the structural change, if bringing social change is something that is really caring about, they should be caring about the structural change, right? But instead they focus on individual agency, which at the end of the day will easily turn to extremely dangerous narrative that we say is harmful for the country. So for these reasons, I'm very, very proud to oppose.
I thank you, the speaker, for her fine speech. The floor is now open. So, may I please remind all of you the general rules for this section. So, each team will be allowed a maximum of 10 questions, with each question being 1 minute long maximum. And teams will be given 1 minute and 30 seconds to reply each question. You are not recommended to direct the question at a particular team member on a team. Also, before asking a question, please identify yourself by name and your school. Thanks a lot. The floor is now open. Interested individuals, please either raise your hand so I can call you for questions. Yes.
Hello, sorry, this is Vlado from Southland School, the team being SIS, very original. My question is to the opposition, and we see that in fact, whenever there's a historical figure in a country, they can be very important in terms of advancing that country, protecting its patriotism, and allowing the people to move on from colonialism. We saw this, for example, with Gandhi in India after colonialism, whereby he's remembered as a national hero, and we see that his sort of movement and the people's love for it has enabled the people to be very patriotic and to love their country and kind of forget that it was almost initiated by the United, but kind of forget the decolonization stage that was going on at the time. So wouldn't you perhaps consider that having an important figure like that can be very beneficial in terms of maintaining a patriotic and proud population?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. My name is Bon. I'm from HKU. Responding to your question, first of all, because in the context of the debate, because proposition did not define or understand individual agents as individual war heroes, I don't think that was particularly relevant to debate. But even so, on the premise of your question, we don't necessarily think that is a good thing on our side of the debate. We do feel that nations have to take a look at their national situation, so to speak, and to construct their national narratives on the basis of their practicality and realism and what they need. And if it so happens that national hero was useful, good for them. But we don't think, as a rule of thumb, as a general rule, it is good necessarily for post-colonial state. Oh, we must follow the footsteps of Gandhi or whoever. We don't think it is a good narrative, and is not a sustainable narrative.
I thank the speaker for his speech.
Alright, so my name is Samuel. I'm from Chinese University of Hong Kong. Alright, so my question is this. It's more like it's the opposition, and it's more or less a clarification about opposition case. So I'm not really sure about what is the purpose that you are trying to get at. The case that I got roughly is that you are trying to use structural information that is more accurate to mobilize people. However, the assumption that you seem to be making is that firstly, the information somehow could mobilize the people who you say don't even care about those individual war heroes. But secondly, that these information will somehow also be not disagreed upon. As you see, a lot of times people disagree about these structural reasons as well. For example, a lot of people in India may be seeing independence as perhaps a structural reason that is more or less led by a certain dominant race, which also can lead to the same divisiveness that you are so opposed to. However, these war heroes who are a few generations ago probably will arouse a lot less of these antagonisms. But lastly, also on how would these information actually be useful given that situation is a lot more different right now. So yeah, so how is that? So what exactly is the case?
Thank you, Samuel. This is Yuka from HKU. So in response to our champion's question, so I think that, so first of all, in terms of the idea of divisiveness, well, we think that compared to our side of the house, we necessarily cause less divisiveness, because if you think about the idea or the very nature of individual agencies, necessarily a very congregated or centralized group of people that people can physically or immediately think about, right? So compared to, for example, the structural reasons, the structural causes that, for example, is more textual or can be more objectively assessed, you think that at the minimum, at least comparatively, our side can cause less divisiveness, because we think that a central or a heroic figure that suddenly is created as a personality cult, we think that can potentially create more divisiveness because of this nature as a person, and compare outside to more objective. But the second reason is about the idea of information is not always useful. So I think that, well, comparatively, because this debate is always about comparative analysis, but basically there has a vacuum of information, right? Because what they are doing is that they are focusing on the individual's agents only, and this is very easy with the mentality in mind that they will crowd up other sorts of potential causes that cause the historical downturn. So we think that at least comparatively our side is minimally better. So thank you.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech.
I am Misha Fischer from German Swiss International School. This question is directed at the proposition team. So let's assume that people accept this narrative that their independence is the result of individual agents. And let's also take one of your characterizations of these countries as being somewhat more newly post-colonial, as you tried to characterize them as. But do you think it's rather dangerous to sort of idolize individual agents or individual parties, and it's rather dangerous to have this idea that they are the ones that made them independent? What we see in places like Africa, in many different countries in Africa, an increasing incidence of something called third termism. Essentially, these presidents that were perhaps elected using this idolism that has been placed upon them to try and seek to change their constitutions and seek third terms and stay in power, actually a step back from this newly found independence. Don't you think that it's rather dangerous to have these idols in place, given this sort of negative consequences and this negative power that is put in place of the individuals and the individual agents involved?
Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Timothy from UC. I think the first thing we have to clarify is what exactly they're talking about structural change and structural cause. I think there needs to be certain differentiation of the two. Because structural change inevitably happens after colonialism, right? That occurs regardless of different governments, different ideology, that still happens. But what the debate is about is who actually empowers the people to recognize that it is not only structural causes that brought changes, but it is also about the people's effort, right? So on your point of fearing of third termism or different governments intending to change constitutions, we think it is ever more important at that point when these people are more empowered to believe that they can actually bring the sort of changes that they couldn't do so during colonialism, right? Because we've already analysed and dissected the how society in a colonial society is, where all the political and economic capital lies within the upper class. And we think ever more in order to go through a peaceful transition period, we need the people's involvement within these issues. And we think to recognize they have the power, when they follow different movements and different leaders, they would be more empowered and inspired to do so. And we think that isn't achieved on their side.
I thank the speaker for his following speech. Yes.
My name is Nicole Liu. I'm from South London School, and my question is to Team Proposition. I'd like to point out that independence often comes about because of the actions of the people, which does show some degree of initiative on their part. So why is the usual post-independence or post-revolution patriotic fever and enthusiasm insufficient to shake them free from those, shake those still trapped in the colonialist mindset necessary if there is still any of that mindset lingering? Thank you.
So, I think throughout the debate, we recognise that the characterisation, which is there are different people who buys into the paradigm of colonialism, and there are people who does not, right? So we believe, as it was pointed out in the debate, that the minority doesn't believe that countries should be independent from its the empire, right? We think particularly we told you when the grassroots movements and the lower middle class would now be able to change, drive huge impact, huge social changes within the country. Then this will propel people who are disinterested with independence before, right? Because given such a massive social movement is occurring, they take into account their own benefits, they take into account of their own lifestyle, right? We think these sort of build a discourse and shift their attention and towards how these ongoing movements and independence movements are shaped, right? So we believe more of these people will now will now pay attention to how how individual agents and movements is occurring within the society. Whereas we think with structural causes, at the very first place when these sort of movements doesn't occur, we believe these individuals' mindset aren't going to change, and we think the backlash still exists, whether we provide a constructive discourse that solves the problem.
I thank the speaker for his following speech. We currently entertain more questions from the floor. Seeing none, we will proceed to the reply speech section. Both teams will be given 1 minute to prepare their reply speech. The time starts now. Time's up. May I now invite the opposition reply speech speaker to conclude the case and sign off. Here.
Opposition's narrative that they want to construct is this: individuals who fought in the war should be credited, and to an extent that it trumps the structural reason from the international arena that allowed this nation to become independent. There's not much talk. In fact, there was no talk about personality cults. The emphasis was on the individuals who were oppressed, individuals who fought, and those specific individuals who led the war, right? We feel ultimately the ultimate utility that they proposed in why these nations should adapt this narrative at the cost of emphasizing this over structural reasons is because this kind of narrative gives people hope. This kind of narrative invigorates people. This kind of narrative allows people to shred off their shackles of bondage and realize that they are worthy of the dignity that they have. That, I believe, I'm quoting you fairly genuinely. So I believe that is the case that they put forward. We tell you this. We think, first of all, this kind of invigoration and hope exists anyway. We tell you, secondly, it is disingenuous for a nation to construct a narrative that is inaccurate to historical facts. We think it is important to not lie to your citizen as to why you got independent. It is important for you to not lie to your citizen what was the circumstance that you got independent, because it prevents your nation from making the right choices that prevent you from being colonized again. Thirdly, we think human beings are very capable of hope and invigoration. That is the reason why they got up from their beds and their farms to fight off the colonial oppressors, right? So ultimately, we think that the utility coming from a proposition does not really exist. However, what do we have for you? We told you these we characterize these post-colonial states for you. We told you these post-colonial states require narratives that are slightly more nuanced than about who was right and who was wrong, right? We told you that these post-colonial states require narratives that allow these nations to move forward and allow these nations to recognize the harms, the benefits, the horrors, and the good things left by imperialism, right? These are the things that we told you. We told you it is important not to fractionalize these nations, again, by narratives that you construct. And we told you again and again, it is likely that that kind of scenario will not happen on our side of the paradigm, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about the example that I brought up. Ladies and gentlemen, China recognizes the personal individual contributions in the war, right? It also recognizes the structural changes, the structural causes in which why it was so brutally colonized by so many nations in the first place, right? We believe that is the kind of narrative that is slightly better for different nations. We believe that kind of approach is slightly better for different nations constructing their narratives, right? We think a blanket approach in which proposition proposes to conclude all narratives were only, individuals were the only cause, and the foremost, most important cause is disingenuous, historically inaccurate, and not useful. Vote for opposition. Thank you very much.
I think the speaker for a final speech may now invite the proposition reply speaker to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
Let's take a step back and understand what this debate is about. Given that this debate is about government propaganda, how the government actively promotes how the state is built, we argue the most important factor in this is how people are affected by this, right? Throughout the bench, we talked about how essentially colonialism is actually still persistent in these countries. We talked about how essentially people don't think they deserve to brag for it, don't think they deserve to ask for equal treatment. We argue that without political participation, whatever social cause that they bring up will not get any support, will not get any interest from the people, and ultimately will not bring for change. We tell you proudly that for people of colonialism, we're very proud to propose, right? Let's take a look at opposition. We do not actually see how this case brings by any tangible benefit, right? Number one, we don't essentially see how remembering mechanisms of social causes of independence benefits a country. Given that we're talking about the causes of independence, not the causes of that country being colonized, right? We don't see how the China example is relevant at all, given the wording of the motion. I already talked about in my speech how essentially what we're talking about is things that are related to the colonizing country, right? Things that have no relevance, for example, Britain being weakened in World War II, that have no relevance at stake here. And more importantly, you see how their whole case basically hinges on the sole benefit that this affects the leaders of these countries, right? Which we arguably believe that, number one, they should know that already. Number two, we do not see how that boils down to the crux of this motion, which is the people, and mobilizing the people to ensure that they get what they want, right? But even more importantly, aside from that, the only distinctive thing that they brought us is that essentially that this causes divisiveness in society, this causes unique harm in that sense, right? Number one, we don't essentially see, in my speech I already talked about how mobilizing the people to care about these issues invites discourse and invites them to actually iron out these differences and focus their attention on bringing this country forward, right? But more importantly, we also do not see how, number one, discourse does not exist on the paradigm as I talked about. But we also believe that essentially individual participation is the only way to iron out these differences ultimately, right? Because even if we let leaders understand the causes of colonialism and the causes of, let's say, the reason why these countries became independent, we do not see how this boils down to solving the difference between the people, right? We argue that the people need to be motivated to come up and speak about these things, to talk about what happened before from their personal experiences, to talk about how we want to solve this in the future, how to prevent these things from happening in the future. That's how we argue essentially closure happens, and that's how we argue essentially states move on from colonialism, right? But ultimately, what we essentially take as most important is this. We believe that essentially has not shown us in their world, in their best case, how people will change, how essentially there'll be any tangible difference from adopting our paradigm, right? They haven't given us any mechanism of change of the importance of these causes that leads to these governments being better, right? On the flip side, we talked about how essentially people will be able to be transformed themselves into political capital. We talked about how this motivates people to step up from very pragmatic grounds of, let's say, discriminatory laws on discriminatory practices and get rid of them. We talked about how essentially this rallies people to politically allow them to have a say in what this country's future is like. And ultimately, we believe that because post-colonialism is an end to what's in the past, we believe that people deserve that future too. Very, very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and this concludes the debate. We look forward to the adjudicators' feedback after the deliberation session. Thank you very much.